Okay, good.
All right. Well, welcome to this.
Hi,
is
Jennifer.
Hi. This is the fourth in the 4-part series that Desi has been doing all year, and this time we're going to be talking about winter plant lore. And I'm wondering if we do have a smaller turnout this time than usual. I'm wondering if people just think there aren't winter plants. So I bet Desi is going to surprise us on that. So I just want to take a second to introduce Desi. Desiree Bridge is an historian with a passionate interest in the medical, culinary, and gardening knowledge from America's and England's past. Desiree has a degree in history from UNC Greensboro and a degree in baking and pastry from Johnson and Wales Charlotte. The homework from that sounds really fun. After 15 years of study, she is always happy to learn new information, experiment in her garden, and try out traditional recipes in her kitchen or fire pit. So if you put your Zoom on speaker view, you'll be able to see Desi in full screen, because we'll be doing slides later. So take it away, Desi.
All right. Well, thank you for those that are joining me today or maybe later on. I know it's this magical time of the year where everyone's traveling. If folks are getting perhaps their booster or their flu shot, they may not be feeling 100%. I understand I got mine last week and it took me out for about 3 days. So winter, this is actually my favorite talk. I know a lot of folks think that this time of the year, there wasn't much going on. If you had joined me for the spring talk, I mentioned that it's really late winter, early spring that you're going to have your leanest time of the year. We're still technically in fall. The first day of winter isn't until December 21st. So even though it does kind of, for the South, look like a wintry day outside, the temperature dropped, it's gray. Yesterday felt more like a traditional fall day. That said, you're still going to be doing a lot of fall chores. So that's another reason why people are going to be pretty active even up into the 21st of December. You might be finishing slaughtering the animals that are not going to be joining you through the winter time. You're still going to be preserving. In fact, you're preserving whatever food items you can year round. And you're going to be gearing up for winter chores. And winter chores are going to be candle making, mending. You're going to be carding your wool and then spinning. And keep in mind, the sewing and mending was not a woman's chore. Gentlemen were just as handy with a needle and thread historically as women were. When it comes to plants, there's quite a few surprises when it comes to what was excited and looked for in the wintertime. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is your citrus fruit. Citrus is typically a winter crop, so you're not going to be getting as excited in the summertime as we do today about oranges, lemons, and limes. If you've ever wondered why at Christmas time you got an orange in your stocking, it comes from this time of where it was finally in harvest. If you weren't able to get that fruit in fresh, you could have gotten it in one of its many preserved ways. And one of the easiest ways to preserve your citrus is to actually take it and pierce up towards the stem. Make sure you don't go into the pith. So you're just going through the skin itself. And you would string it up in your kitchen, which was a nice dry place. Think of it as a large humidifier, and give it some time. It's going to end up feeling like plastic fruit. You could zest that and use that throughout the year for your cooking and your baking. Same with your lemons and limes. You could also candy the peels, which we have a recipe for later on. You are going to be getting, of course, vitamin C from your citrus. You're also going to be getting some minerals, some fiber out of it. And I've mentioned this many times before, but remember, you don't know why historically, before modern medicine, certain items made you feel better. It's just trial and error. And so for a lot of folks, citrus was good because you don't have to worry about scurvy, which is pretty nasty. Now, another item that you're going to see in season this time of the year is rose hips. And you could either be cultivating your rose hips from European breeds that you brought over with you, or you could be using rose hips from a native rose. It has a couple different names. Most of the time it is listed as the Carolina rose. You can also see it being called the Cherokee rose, the Virginia rose, the pasture rose. It's really beautiful. It loves to grow in thickets. It has a very, very bright pink petal, and the center is this bright butter, kind of like a buttercup yellow. Now, these are your simple roses. They are not multi-petaled like some of the more modern breeds we're used to today. It looks almost like a larger version of a primrose, if you've ever had those in your garden. Rose hips are also high in vitamin C, and historically, rose was a very popular flavoring in your sweet treats. So whereas today we tend to use really one flower in a lot of our baking, vanilla, historically you see them using gardenias, rose, violets, a whole wide range. Now, you can collect rose hips. You do need to process them a bit though. And the reason you need to process your rose hips is because the inner parts, they've got some seeds, and also you've got a little bit of like little feathery looking pieces of that rose hip. You don't want to eat those because they're going to get down in your throat and they're going to irritate you. Think of a rose hip as fish with some bones in it, and you need to process it a bit. So what you would do with your rose hip is you would just slice it in half, clean out the inner part, wash it, and then you're able to use it. And the simplest thing you could do with your rose hips is soak it in hot water and make a tea. Typically today when we drink rose tea, we're using the petals, but the rose hip itself has more of a fruit-like flavor to it. It's really, really delicate and really, really nice if you ever get a chance. It does smell like roses, so if you're not particularly keen on rose perfume, you may not like them. But along with being high in vitamin C, we also see it having, just like your citrus fruit, high in minerals and also some fiber. Now, rose could also be distilled and used as a topical treatment. In fact, we're starting to see tonic waters, and I'm talking not tonic waters that you're putting in a cocktail, but the tonic waters you might be using on your skin, showing up in grocery stores more and more. It used to be a couple years ago, you had to go online if you wanted to find them, but distilled rose petal and rose hips are supposed to help with acne, rosacea. Keep in mind, if you are going to try rose petals or rose hips as a topical treatment, try a small area. Some folks, it works beautifully. Others, it can cause dermatitis and other problems. So I don't really recommend you venture into that realm unless you've used it before or you know you don't have an allergy to roses. Now, speaking of topical treatments, there's another plant that is flowering actually this time of the year. So it's not so much the dried up little rose hips that you're beginning. You're going to be pulling off the actual flower, and that is your witch hazel. I highly recommend, if you can ever get your hands on a witch hazel, to have it in your garden. It is a beautiful tree to have. I love the branches, but this time of the year going into winter, it's going to put out what looks almost like yellow little firecrackers. And it's just a beautiful plant to have in your garden when everything else is pretty much losing its leaves and buds and such. Witch hazel, you could use the flower. We also see the bark being used, the leaves being used. And this was a remedy that a lot of your earlier folks coming to America from Europe noticed the native people using and incorporated it into a lot of their medicinal care. As far as witch hazel goes, digesting it and using it for medical properties, there's not really any evidence out there that it's beneficial to your health. It's not going to hurt you, but no one's really come out with any findings saying, at least that I've seen, I'm not saying they're out there, but that witch hazel can cure you of various ailments. It really seems to be throughout its history that it's being used as a topical treatment. And again, it's for acne. It's going to be for rosacea, any type of redness of the skin, but we also see it being used as a treatment for cuts and burns. So think of it as basically a peroxide or rubbing alcohol that we tend to keep in our homes today that you would have had in your home in the past. If you aren't near somewhere where you're growing witch hazel, it is native to this country. This is something you could easily get from an apothecary or shipped in, because it is going to be distilled. It's preserved, so you don't have to worry about it going bad when it comes to you. Now, in the realm of trees, and you may notice I'm moving a little quicker through the plants this go around than I have in the past. That's because I wanted to do quite a bit on winter folklore. So I've got a lot of plants to pack in this go around. So from the witch hazel tree, we are now moving on to conifers. So your conifers are going to be Eastern hemlock. No, this is not the same hemlock that took out Socrates. That is a herbaceous plant. It's in the carrot family. The hemlock I'm talking about is a beautiful, beautiful tree. It puts off beautiful little pine cones, and it's safe. The same with your firs and your spruces. Now, what you're going to be interested in is not so much the pine cones, but when you're looking at the branches and they're putting off new growth, you have that little bright green bit at the end. That's what you're going to be harvesting. With your conifers, they are also high in vitamin C. You may be noticing a trend right now. Every plant that I've talked about just about is high in vitamin C, because you want to keep that in your diet throughout the winter time. Now, in the warmer months, you're getting that vitamin C from a lot of the plants coming in from your garden. But even though you will be planting things in your garden this time of the year, you still want to supplement it with some other things. Conifers, as far as the flavoring, are kind of becoming popular again in this country. You see a lot of hipsters getting into it, whether they're making teas or they're adding the flavor to their beer. I personally have a hard time embracing conifers. I love, love, love the smell of conifers, but I typically want that smell in a cleaning solution, think of Pine Sol, or in a candle that I'm burning this time of the year because I can't have a real tree in my home. I also will have little small ones back here. And the reason I don't have a real tree is because I have a big moose of a dog who would like to curl up underneath it. So it's better just to stay with a fake tree at this point. If you're going to use any type of conifer at home, I do recommend that you do your research. You make sure it is an edible conifer, because there's yew, which is also a conifer, Y-E-W, that is poisonous. Please don't even think about digesting it. And if you go out and you're looking at your conifer or evergreen and you have no idea what a yew looks like, stay away from it. The best thing to do is to go online and get spruce or fir extract and get it from a viable source. Once you have that extract, and it's a food grade extract, I recommend you then smell it, maybe make up a pot of plain old tea, put a little splash in and taste it and go from there. That's going to give you a good idea if you want to start digesting it. Some people are going to love the flavor. Others, such as myself, are going to be like, that's really lovely, but I'm not too keen on digesting them. It's just my palate. The other problem with certain conifers is they can cause dermatitis. So if you are naturally allergic to a conifer, let's say when they produce their pollen, your allergies are high, you may want to stay away from using these extracts too. If you're into home brewing, and you want to make a colonial beverage that was very popular up and down the eastern seaboard into the interior of our country, and also really popular with the navies, because again, you have that vitamin C in there, so you're not going to have to worry about scurvy for your sailors on the ship. I recommend you get some of that extract and you try it out. It's again, it's going to be a little different, but it is a taste of history. It's pretty amazing. Now, along with the vitamin C, we also see conifers being used as a treatment for poor circulation. There's actually research right now where they're trying to see if it can be used for those who are suffering jet lag. And it was sometimes used for pain. We see some records, and these, I have to admit, this is up in Canada with your French explorers suffering from scurvy. And there are a couple records where they wrote down that the local tribes they came into contact with gave them a tea, and it was a conifer tea. And after drinking that over a couple days, they actually started feeling better. They figured out what trees, so when they went further into the country that they were exploring, again, Canada, they just kept making these tea, and basically they're getting the vitamin C into their diet, and they were no longer suffering from the effects of scurvy. Now, from conifers, we're going to stay in the tree family. And next up, I'm going to be talking about acorns. And you do not need to have a certain type of oak tree. You can also use the live oak that we find all over the place around here for these types of acorns. They are edible. If you've never eaten an acorn before, it's kind of like a black walnut and a chestnut in between the two flavors. It's high in tannins, so it's going to be more along a black walnut if you've never had a chestnut, but there is that sweetness in acorns that you do get from your chestnut. If you want to make your own acorn flour, which is very doable, and people would have done historically if they were not able to get enough grains to produce their own flour, or something happened, perhaps pests had gotten into their flour sacks. This time of the year, you're probably tripping over them, mowing them over. Acorns are all over the place. You're going to harvest them this time of the year. You're going to want to do a light leaching of the nut before you start processing it, just to pull some of those tannins out. Mainly because most people don't particularly care for that bitter flavor that will end up in the flour. Also, some folks prefer the color to be a little lighter, whereas if you use your acorn without leaching any of the tannins out, it will be a darker flour. It's up to you in preference and taste. The best way to soak them is to crack them open. You're going to take out the acorn nut, put it in cold water, and then let that sit overnight, maybe 2-3 days, depending on how much of the tannins you want to leach out. It is highly recommended that you use the cold water leaching treatment instead of putting them in boiling water, because it's going to keep the starch strong in your acorns. If you boil, you're going to break down the starch, and acorns don't have gluten like your grains do. So you're going to have a hard enough time kind of building that up when you're making your breads. So if you have someone that's a celiac or gluten sensitive, this might be a fun flour to make at home. Now, once you've soaked the nuts, you see variations of folks that actually will then mill it or put it in a food processor and add water to it so that it almost looks like a very chunky protein shake, and soaking it further that way. Other folks say, okay, I've gotten enough of the tannins out. They'll actually strain out the nuts, let them dry, food process it down. And then if you don't use the flour right away, you're either going to want to let it kind of dry out a little bit on trays, or maybe you're going to want to put it in a bag and then store it in the freezer. Acorns are like any other nut you might get your hands on. The oils can go rancid. So the best place to store your acorns, if you're not going to process them right away, is in your freezer. Now, acorns, not only are they gluten-free, they are high in a lot of great things. They've got vitamin A and E. They also have vitamin K. They're high in minerals. So if you ever even just want to take some and roast them up and just snack on them, you don't have to turn them into a flour. I recommend it. It's kind of unique. It's one of those things that sadly kind of fell out of flavor in America. And recent years, you're starting to see it coming back in and gaining in popularity again. If you don't want to go through the hassle of what I just described for making your own acorn flour, you can find it online. But I do recommend maybe harvesting some acorns, and you want the acorns that have fallen on the ground. And it is nature. There are critters out there. So you're going to want to take those shells and wash them pretty good before you crack into them. But again, roast them up and give it a try and see if you like it or not. It could be you don't like the tannins, and then just soak it, roast them the next time and see how it goes. Now, we're going to move away from trees. I mentioned earlier, there are things you're going to be growing in your garden. So your garden is still a very important part of your property this time of the year. You are going to switch over to plants that do better. So maybe kales and lettuces that fall within the winter growing season. You're going to be growing carrots. In fact, some of the sweetest tasting carrots come from your winter crops. Beets are also still being grown this time of the year. Now, you have to protect them to a point. And we see this throughout all of history. What you're going to be doing is you could simply cover them with a cloth. You could see elaborate to very, very simple cold frames being built up around them. If you had money, maybe glass bells and jars would be sat over each individual plant, which is unbelievably beautiful. But most people could not afford to put those glass bells over each and every plant. So you might see terracotta being used in place. Again, if that's not readily available, you can see something as simple as a bunch of branches going down and then draping a cloth across that. And you're going to uncover it in the morning, let the sun get to the plants. And then as evening comes in, especially if you're fearing for frost, you're going to cover them. But by doing this, you're going to be able to harvest these plants into late winter until you basically have gotten everything you can out of that plant and you're getting ready to till the soil and prepare it for basically the next batch of crop coming in. The kale that you're going to be growing, your carrots, again, a whole bunch of vitamins and minerals that you're going to need to be getting into your system. Were they making kale chips back then is a question I get a lot because they became very popular a couple of years ago. I haven't seen any recipes, but I'm not saying they aren't. We do see some recipes, though, pop up every once in a while, usually from those of French descent, candying their carrots. So they would basically cook the carrots down in simple syrup and then pour that into another jar with simple syrup on top and use those almost as a sweet garnish throughout the winter time. So those are the plants that you're going to be harvesting or you're going to be growing this time of the year. Now, December 21st is going to be a very important day throughout agrarian cultures, society, since way, way back in its fuzzy origins. And I'm mainly talking about European and European descent here in this country. It is the longest night of the year. Most of the time, you're finally going to see people put their feet up for just a bit and kind of rest from the harvesting season. We see a lot of feasting going on. We see a lot of drinking going on and a lot of secular events and holidays occurring between the 21st and into January that will later on transition into Christmas traditions that we have today. I'm not even going to try to jump into the debate of who invented what and where it came from. But one thing we would have seen the early settlers in North Carolina doing this time of the year is gearing up for your winter solstice and the holiday season. And they're going to be going outside and they're going to start harvesting evergreens. Now, it could be they're bringing in the evergreens to decorate their mantle. If you go into the interior of the state, to the Moravians, they might be putting up, it almost looks like a tiered pyramid, and putting some greenery on that along with scripture and candles. But things are dying off outside. You still want the inside to have a little bit of greenness to it. It also coincides with the birth of Christ. So you're going to want to have life in your home reflecting that. But there's also a lot of folklore behind these plants. You're getting to the darkest day of the year. There can be some evil things going on out there. And you see this folk trail going even to those that are of Catholic and Protestant faith. Again, when people are like, I can't believe people believed that back then, they did not have electricity. You are not burning candles all the time like you see in the movies. It looks beautiful in the movies. But until you've had to make a batch of candles like I have, the traditional way, you're going to burn them for so long as you need them. You're going to go to bed early. You're going to snuff out those candles, and you're going to store them in a candle box so they stay nice and protected throughout the winter time. Bringing in certain plants were believed to kind of bring in good luck, so long as you keep them in at a certain time. So holly, we tend to, in this country, start decorating way back in Thanksgiving. So you might be having some fake holly or real holly in your home. That's fine. But certain groups believe that you needed to get that holly out of your home by Christmas Day, at the latest New Year's Day, because afterwards you're just asking for all kinds of bad luck to come into your home. You're going to anger all kinds of ancestors that you're going to be thinking about during this time period. That said, it is all right for holly to stay up in churches year round. One of the reasons people believe holly was used quite a bit in decor is because you do have those bright, shiny green leaves that last pretty long after cutting. Of course, you have the red berries that are just as beautiful this time of year. Later on, for those of you in your Christian faith, they're going to be following that because the pointy the pointy leaves reminded them of the crown of thorns that was placed on Christ's head. If you are going to be looking at some of your books this time of the year to get into the holiday flair, let's say Charles Dickens, he actually mentions holly a couple times. In fact, two of his ghosts that are visiting Scrooge are using holly. One is a wand, one is on his head as a kind of nice little holiday festive crown. It was a very popular thing to have for the 12 days of Christmas. But again, you want to get it out by Epiphany. Really, you're pushing it then. Epiphany's January 6th. So really, first day of the new year, you want to get holly out. Now, ivy is another plant growing this time of the year that you're going to be bringing into your home. And sadly, ivy is popular, but it's just not as popular as your holly. One, it can look a little straggly this time of the year. Also, it tends to grow really well near cemeteries. So sometimes it did have this cross-reference of being a death plant. So we'll see people bringing it in, but it's not as prevalent as a plant as holly. Now in America, we do have the American holly. In this area, we have another plant that puts off beautiful berries this time of the year, and that's the Yopon. You probably see it all over the place. It is native. It's really trendy right now to drink Yopon tea. Do be careful with Yopon tea. It is a native caffeine plant. The caffeine's great from it. You could be like me though. Every time I drink it, I get a very scratchy throat. So I am no longer trying that tea. It's a shame. It's a very nice tea. It basically tastes like an expensive black leaf tea. So if you ever get your hands on Yopon tea, try it. If you get a scratchy throat, like I do, don't drink it anymore. If it doesn't affect you and you're trying to get away from, let's say, coffee, and you want to try a more native caffeinated plant, that is your plant to try. Yule Log. I get a lot of questions this time of the year on the Yule log. Where's its origins? I'm not going to go there. The Yule log goes way back in history. What I can tell you is we do see the traditions pop up in this country. Your Yule log resides in your hearth, and your hearth was such an important part of your home until modern times. And even today, unless you do take out quite frequently, which I'm not judging, some people just don't like to cook. For most of us, our stove is a very important object in our kitchen, and the thought of it malfunctioning gives us a heart attack. So the stove has replaced the hearth. We don't really respect and treat our stove, though, as people would historically their hearth. By putting a Yule log in the hearth, we see quite a few records of people feeding it during the 12 days of Christmas. And to feed it, you are going to drizzle on top of that Yule log some type of alcohol, whether it's cider, which was kind of the preferred beverage in America early on, or maybe some grain alcohol that you had, or if you had good wine or you could afford wine, you were going to pour some wine on top of it. Typically, you're starting this year's Yule log with charred bits from the previous year's Yule log, and you're trying to bring luck into your home. There's some belief that it had to do also with hearth spirits or ancestors that may have resided in the hearth. And by keeping them happy, you were always going to have a fire. Now, I can't stress how important it is to get a fire up and going. If you just go on to any outdoors website, there are so many fun little gadgets nowadays. So if you go camping to start a fire, I like how it's becoming also trendy to do the flint and steel. If you've had to use flint and steel to get a fire up and going like I have, I don't like it. And it's not easy. You've got flint pieces flying at you all over the place. And when you finally get a spark, half the time the spark goes over here when you want it to go over here. So it's not that easy. Typically, what you're going to do at night is you're going to let the fire down to hot coals, and then you're going to bury it with your ash so that the following morning when you uncover it, you've bedded the hearth, you've protected the coals, and when you uncover it, you've got a base for getting your fire back up and going. So if you see how important that is, by basically having that Yule log, you're kind of you're saying to your hearth, come on, work with me this year. I'm feeding you. Let's have this following year. You work every time and start a fire so that you're not smoking me out, and I can make this meal and get everything else done that I need to, and you'll provide the warmth into my home. You're going to see Yule logs kind of die off in the hearth as we progress into the 1800s. And that's because something comes about to really change how we look at a hearth and a fireplace, and that's coal. Coal is also going to take someone that through history was there, but suddenly becomes a very important part of your community, and that's your chimney sweep. If you've ever wondered why there's all these cute little ornaments of chimney sweep boys, why in Mary Poppins they're always mentioning good luck, it stems from the fact that when we switched over to coal produced a lot more soot up into your chimney. You needed to clean it more regularly, and it was a lot harder to clean than in the past when you were using wood. You could even see in Wales people taking their holly branches and making bundles of it, tying strings on either end, dropping it down, and having someone on the roof and someone down below pulling the string back and forth to clean out their chimney that way. It's not going to work if you've got a coal fire. So you're going to have a chimney sweep come in and clean that chimney for you. Coal doesn't need such a wide space. So your chimneys, your fireplaces, your hearths become smaller. So you do see gentlemen as chimney sweeps, but it's going to become easier sometimes for young boys to be your chimney sweep. We're not going to go down the very dark path that was, because sadly, a lot of these boys did not live good lives. It was a pretty rough life for them to have. They're breathing in all of that soot as they're up there. You go into your cities, you might have a flume go this way and maybe a little this. It's just, I can't imagine that life whatsoever. But on New Year's Day, chimney sweeps had their day. They were considered very, very lucky in many different countries, not just in England and in parts of Europe, but also here in the States. And what you have is New Year's Day, something called your first footer, which means the first person into your home is going to bring you luck. If it's a chimney sweep and they're there to clean your chimney on the first day of the new year, that is really good luck. And you could even see some areas where you would just have the chimney sweep come in, kind of say hello to your hearth, not even clean it, and leave. And you're like, yes, I've got good luck. My house isn't going to burn down because I've got a properly taken care of fireplace, and my hearth is going to light every day. I hate to say it, but there were two people you did not want walking into your home the 1st of January. It's going to be women. I'm sorry. I don't know why history hates us so much, but also your redheads. They said redheads need not apply. So basically, what I see every once in a while is them mentioning they would like a tall, dark stranger, preferably male, being the first person to walk into their home and basically bless their hearth. And he might bring them in a sprig of greenery that they could use to decorate. So that is the all over the place kind of plant lore that I had. Now, with it being the winter time, and I like talking about what moons we have, December's moon is known as the cold moon, the oak moon, the long moon. January's is known as the wolf's moon, the ice moon, and then February is the storm moon and the snow moon. It's also known as the hunger moon because February was a pretty rough month sometimes to get through. We have some slides, and I'm going to go over some of the recipes and also the craft, and then we'll have time for questions. All right.
Desi, did that work? Can you see my, can you
Oh,
see
yes,
this?
sorry. Yeah, I can see the cardinal. Yes.
Okay.
So a little fun fact. I'm glad to pick this cardinal. Cardinals actually are, not only do we love them in the wintertime because they're such a bright splash of color, but historically, the myth is if you see a cardinal, it's a loved one that is passed on, that is visiting and making sure all is well. So that is one reason why these birds are so well loved. It was oftentimes thought of as you saw a cardinal, might be a grandparent, parent, or just someone you love dearly that's passed on, checking in to make sure everything was okay. I knew an older woman when I worked at Old Salem, and she said, I know it's probably not my husband, but I like to think it's him. And she said, so whenever cardinals were landing, she said, I would go out and just quietly talk to them. And she said, I just felt so much peace seeing those pretty little birds out in my backyard. So thank you, Liz, for picking that one. All right, on to our first slide. All right, to preserve citrus. So I mentioned earlier that your citrus could be preserved by piercing it. And this photo is great because if you look at those lemons in the bowl, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. It's the top part of the lemon where the stem would have come off. Most of your citrus fruit is going to have that little kind of pop-up. If not, again, when you have your needle, just make sure you're going as close to the stem surface as possible. If you do pierce down into the pith, into the center part of the fruit itself, keep an eye on it. With that oxygen getting down in there, you can see maybe the fruit itself starting to rot or go bad. But if you pierce at the top, they are going to dry beautifully. You don't want them touching each other though. So when you string them up, you're going to knot it so that each one has its own segment on the string, or you can hang them up kind of across away if you don't want to go lengthwise. And that way you don't have to worry about them sliding into each other. Pick a spot in your home. If you have a garage, maybe out in your garage where you don't have to worry about high humidity. I've known some folks that will even take like a clothes rack that they might use for drying wool clothing, and they'll hang strings of fruit off in that, and then just kind of, if they've got space in their kitchen, they'll put it next to their oven. I will put mine sometimes out in the shed because my shed stays pretty dry. If I'm worried about the humidity, we've had some high humidity the last couple days, I will bring my citrus that I'm drying inside. If you don't want to string them up, you can always go ahead and just peel the fruit, cut away the pith. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about pith, if you look at the segments of the lemons, that white bit between the skin and the fruit itself, that's the pith. It's not going to hurt you if you eat it, but it's pretty bitter. So you just want to get rid of that. So just cut that off. After you've cut off the skin, ironically, it almost looks like the part of your Band-Aid where it's got all those little tiny holes in it. You're going to lay them then on some parchment paper on a tray, or you can put them up on a rack and just let it dry out that way. All right, next slide. All right, so let's say you decided not to string up your lemons. You're going to want to just skin them and get rid of that pith. What you can do is candy them. And I do this every year with lemons and oranges. I'm not as big a fan of limes, which is the only reason I don't do limes. I love candying my lemons and oranges and then using it in baking throughout the holiday season and longer. I also like nibbling on them. It's pretty tasty. This is a super, super easy thing to do. Once you've peeled your citrus, you're actually, I kind of forgot to put a stage in here. I personally skip this stage because I don't think they're too bitter. But if you're worried about your citrus being too bitter, before you put it in a sauce pot with 1 cup of water and 1 cup of sugar, you can put them in a pot of boiling water and just boil them a little bit and strain it off. And that's going to pull out some of the extra essential oil that might be within the skin and mellow the flavor a bit if you don't particularly want your candied fruit to have a slightly bitter undertone. Again, I like it, but I leave it up to you. Once you do add your strips, whether you've pre-boiled them or not, to your simple syrup concoction, you're going to pull it down to a simmer and just let them go for however long you want. Now, obviously, you don't want them to dissolve or be too difficult to pull out, but some people like theirs a little tougher. Some like theirs very tender. Mainly, they're going to look slightly translucent. And when you bite them, it's going to be a tender bite. Strain them off and then plop them into a bowl of loose sugar. It can be plain loose sugar, or you can add spices to it. Play with it. We see recipes in colonial times where they would have put ginger in. Powdered ginger, they might have put powdered cassia or powdered cinnamon. Do whatever you want to do to kind of up the flavor a bit. Once you've powdered them, they're going to feel pretty dry, but you're still going to want to put them on a rack, let them air dry a little longer, and then just store them in a mason jar or a Ziploc bag, whatever mode you prefer. You do not have to put them in the refrigerator. They'll keep for about 6 months. Keep an eye on them though, like anything. Even though sugar is a preservative, there's always that one chance something may have gone wrong. And if they start to mold, just go ahead and get rid of them. But that simple syrup that you cooked your citrus in, Keep it. It is amazing. It's this beautiful, beautiful citrus flavored syrup, which is great in cocktails. But I've also used it and drizzled it on biscuits, cornmeal, pancakes. I love that simple syrup. We also see throughout history that simple syrup being kept, because then you could use it to make comforts. Think of comforts like old-fashioned lozenges that you would have been eating for a sore throat or other ailments. All right, next slide. All right, potato pudding with meat. You might be asking, we did not talk about meat. We did not talk about potatoes. I know, but is this our winter talk? And I really, really wanted some kind of a hearty meal to go into it. And in all fairness, potatoes are going to be eaten quite a bit during the winter months, especially if you have your potatoes stored properly. And you would have kept them down in a cellar or a location similar. You're going to put them in a pretty nice basket that's not solid with straw, and you're going to put them in between the layers, and that's going to keep them. And you want them in the dark somewhere. If they start sprouting, you would just cut the sprouting off. This potato pudding with meat, it may seem strange, but it's really, really, really good. You do want to boil the potato fit to mash, which basically means in our terms today, you're going to want to make a mashed potato. If you don't want to run them through a colander, you can run them through a food mill. If you do not, just make sure when you mash your mashed potatoes, you get it to a pretty fine grain. To make the batter, you want to add your milk and 2 eggs. And this is a thick, thick batter. You still want it to pour, but you don't want it to be a runny batter like crepes or a cake batter. So think more along the lines of like a pancake batter. You're going to take some seasoned steaks, and I recommend slicing them relatively thin. If you're a little leery about cooking this up, you can take steaks that have been already maybe seared. So the cooking process has begun. And in fact, if you sear them and then add them into this, you're just adding another layer of flavor to this pudding. So put your steaks in the bottom of your buttered dish, pour some batter on, add maybe some more steaks, pour the rest of the batter on top, and you're going to bake it up until it's nice and fine. If you're also worried about presentation, maybe you want to, scoop it out instead of cutting it. What you could always do is chop up or smally cube it pretty small, your steak, again, sear it up, mix it in, and then you can always scoop this pudding out. Puddings, I highly recommend giving a go, sweet and savory historical puddings. They may seem daunting, especially if they've not been converted to our modern measurements, but historical puddings are amazing. They're, especially during the colder months of the year, they just warm you. They're just wonderful, wonderful things. They are not like the Jell-O pudding that we get in a box, which there's nothing wrong with that, but most folks today don't realize, unless let's say you come from English heritage where you might be having treacle pudding and such like that, that there's a wide range of them, and the textures range, the flavors, and it's really, really good. All right, next slide. Spruce beer. So I mentioned earlier about your conifers. And again, if you're going to do this, use essence of spruce, and you can find it on Amazon. So if you're wondering where to get it, just type it into Amazon. Another reason spruce was popular in early colonial America is it was before we really started getting our hops up and growing. So this recipe calls for spruce and hops, but some of your older recipes will not have it listed at all. So you're going to boil a handful of your hops and chippings of sassafras root into 10 gallons of water. Strain it, pour it in while hot, 1 gallon of molasses. Now, the molasses they're most likely talking about in 1824 is not going to be the dark molasses we're using today. If you're wary of dark molasses or even molasses flavor, substitute it for golden syrup, which oftentimes when you look at older recipes, they're talking about golden syrup, but they might be mentioning molasses instead, or later on translations of that recipe, they inserted in molasses. Then add in your 2 spoonfuls of essence of spruce. Again, it depends on your taste, how much spruce you want to put in. 2 spoonfuls of powdered ginger, or you could add in whole ginger, but it's just easier to do the powdered ginger. 1 of pounded allspice. Allspice, if you get it in the grocery store whole, looks like large peppercorns. You can just mash that up in a mortar and pestle, a food processor, or you can get it already powdered. And then you put it in a cask. Now, today you're going to obviously put it in a modern at-home brewer's kit bottle. So you may want to follow this recipe so far and then go with your modern kit or whatever you have at home, your modern form of fermentation. But you are going to be adding in yeast to it, which will start the fermentation. After you've let it go through it, you've basically strained it off and you have your drink. It's a taste from the past. This is something that would have been drank just about everywhere on a regular basis. And some of you might love it. Some of you might take a sip and say, oh my goodness, this is kind of like a pine sol cold medicine. I'm not too keen. It just depends on your taste. All right, next slide. So for our crafts, I mentioned cold frames for your winter garden, and I've discovered this one online, and I'm pretty excited because this is the most simple cold frame I've ever seen. I love it. So let's say you went crazy this fall with your display out front, and you've got straw left over, and you looked at your garden and you're like, I don't know if I want to bed down my garden with straw. But you have some tender plants like your lettuces and your carrots that you know can grow in the wintertime, but you're a little worried about how well they'll do if there's a frost. This is an easy thing to do. Put your straw base around it. Find either some cast off glass, or you could quite frankly just get some plastic tarping from a hardware store and put that across. And then in the morning, just roll it back and then roll it back down and pin it down if you want to. I'm telling you, I think I'm going to do this next year. I'm pretty excited about this little system I see here. But again, if you want to use a cold frame, you can find kits for making them in your home. There's lean-to cold frames. There's very elaborate Pinterest, how to do it at home cold frames. The simplest thing is also just getting cloth and tarps from your hardware stores for covering your plants when there is going to be a hard frost. You can just take some down branches. You don't even have to get professional poles, and just drive it across, have it come down. You can anchor it if you have it enough that there's a lip with bricks. Mainly what you're doing is covering that plant so the frost can't settle on it at night. And you do want to uncover it during the day so that the sunlight can get down to those plants. The soil is going to get a little tougher in certain areas in the wintertime. So just make sure if you're going up and having to dig up certain items like your beets and your carrots, you're using a strong fork. You're not using probably one of your more flimsier trowels that you have it's better for flowers and such in the summer months. All right, and final slide. Another way of covering your plants, especially if you've got little carrots and such, I mentioned earlier, some of the wealthy might have beautiful glass bells or terracotta they would put on top. Today, you could just reuse your recycling. Any of your milk jugs that you might have, your juice bottles, just cut the bottom off. You can then take the lid off during the day, pop the lid back on at night, and you've got a perfect little baby greenhouse for each individual plant in your garden. And this is something that might be a little easier than creating a cold frame. Even if you have a larger garden, we tend to go through plastic bottles in this country pretty quickly. I'm sure your neighbors go through plastic bottles pretty quickly too. This project does not take long to set up. You're just basically cutting off the bottom. And this is something I've actually done with even in large terracotta pots, plants that I have that I want to keep going throughout the winter time, certain herbs. but I do not want to cover them every night, especially going into work in the morning. I may not have time to really work on uncovering them. This was an easy alternative. I just go out, take all the lids, drop them in a basket, came home in the evening after dinner, boot the dog out into the yard, put the lids back on, and my plants did well. They grew beautifully. This isn't a picture of mine. Sadly, I can't find mine to save my life. I think my iPhone ate that photo, but I did try it last year and it worked beautifully. And I'm going to try it again this year. I'm hoping maybe I can keep a geranium or two that I've cut back alive this winter using this form of protection. So that is our final talk of plant lore. Does anybody have any questions? I know we were a small group this go around.
Desi, I have a question about the Yule log when you were describing that, because it sounded like you were saying that the Yule log was in the fireplace like over a period of time where they were feeding it alcohol, but then also when they need to burn it. So I got confused about.
Yes, that's where the Yule log, there are so many stories around it. There's so many mythos and fact, and it really came down to a cultural group, a region, and even an individual. Typically, it seems like what you're going to do for the vast majority is you're going to put it in that night, maybe drizzle something on it, burn it for a little bit, let the fire burn down, and then remove it or have it. I don't know. That one is one I've had issues with a couple times. I'm thinking you're going to be burning it in a space that you're not utilizing for your main cooking. Or what you could do is if your hearth, which a lot of these hearths, even in single homes, were pretty large, you could put it to the side and then have your main fire here and your Yule log kind of smoldering off to the side. It always sounds like when you're seeing records that it was the centerpiece, but to me, it doesn't seem feasible because you're still using that hearth during the 12 days of Christmas. So it's the practicality of it is sometimes lost when you're reading up on the Yule log. Folks will talk about, they remember family members taking popcorn kernels and throw it in the fire. So you would see popcorn dancing around it. There's a region in France where when the children weren't looking, sugar plums magically appeared that the Yule log gifted the children. But again, and it could be I've just not delved deep enough into the records. I've often kind of wondered the same thing. I'm like, well, what's the Yule log doing during the rest of the day or when you're doing things? And I know for a fact, having worked in hearths of various sizes, there are sections, and it's usually back in the corner, that you can put something off to the side and still have it burning and still working and still work on this other side. So think of it almost when you're working on your stovetop and you have multiple burners that you're using. It's not like the movies where it's just the main fire in the center and that's what you're fixating on.
Okay, that's helpful. And was the Yule log a certain type of particularly hard wood, or how did they?
Typically it's birch.
Birch.
Mm-hmm. Typically you do see it being birch. It's going to be whatever hardwood you can get your hands on. Sometimes it's large, sometimes it's small. Later on, when the Yule log kind of falls out of trend, we see it work its way to tables as the jelly rolled cake that we tend to call Yule logs today. I've sometimes wonder if the reasons it's a little sketchy to pinpoint things on it is it does have a very heavy pagan past to it. And it, along with certain other celebrations of the 12 days of Christmas, oftentimes your leaders would look at you and say, you really don't need to be doing that. So there's quite a few times where people will still celebrate, but perhaps they're celebrating it in a more subtle tone. Yuletide, Yule logs, I'm going to say in the last 5 years, maybe more, you're starting to see it popping up more and more. It's popping up on Etsy. they're becoming trendy again. Most people today will typically have a Yule log with the little divots in it and their tea candles in it, and we'll be burning it. Historically, it also almost had the feel of like we would an Advent candle wreath that we might light on the Sundays leading up to Christmas Eve. So I often sometimes wonder if it was burnt every day, or if again it was kind of like certain days you had it, other days you didn't, or perhaps most people really just had it either on the winter solstice or on Christmas Eve.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions? All right.
So Desi, you're going to be back next Tuesday. Do you want to tell us what you're going to be talking about next week?
Next Tuesday, I will be talking about Victorian Christmas, and that should be a really entertaining talk because a lot of the traditions that we love today really kind of finalize and become these cohesive thoughts during the Victorian era. And they might have been trends that have been around for a long time, or it could be something new with inventions that were coming about with cooking and baking. And I will be talking, I have to admit, a lot about Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, because thanks to those two, they really, really finalized a lot of what one does during the Christmas season.
Well, that sounds really exciting and a really timely topic. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next Tuesday at the same time, 1 o'clock.
Yes.
And thanks for coming, everybody. We hope to see you next.
Bye.
Turn.